When spectral appearances at Darkwater Estate are followed by mysterious deaths, only one man can separate truth from superstition. Welcome to Cafe Stories. I am your host, Alfie. Your continued support makes these stories possible, and I'm thankful for each of you. Let me know in the comments which corner of the world you're listening from today. Grab something warm to drink, find a comfortable seat, and let's embark on this mystery together. Sherlock Holmes and the Phantom Bride of Darkwater Estate. Chapter 1. The Visitor at Baker Street. It was during the latter part of October in that remarkable year 95 that the singular case which I am about to relate fell under the notice of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The autumn had been unusually bitter, with fierce winds sweeping across London, stripping the trees bare, and driving most sensible folk indoors. Holmes and I had spent the better part of the week confined to our lodgings at Baker Street, he engrossed in a curious monograph on the variations in ash from different types of tobacco, while I attempted to organize my notes from our recent adventure in Cornwall. The weather had done little to improve Holmes's disposition. It had been some weeks since any case of interest had presented itself, and I could see the familiar signs of restlessness beginning to manifest. His keen grey eyes had taken on that distant, unfocused quality that I had come to recognize as a dangerous harbinger. When Holmes was without mental stimulation, he would invariably turn to that 7% solution which I so dreaded, and which had more than once threatened to undermine his remarkable gifts. On this particular morning, as the rain lashed against our windows with uncommon ferocity, Holmes stood by the fire, his tall, lean figure silhouetted against the dancing flames, his pipe sending up lazy spirals of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "Watson," said he, turning suddenly toward Amy, "do you not find it curious that a city of some 4 million souls cannot, at present, furnish us with a single problem worthy of consideration?" I glanced up from my newspaper, which contained nothing but the usual political controversies and petty crimes. "Perhaps it is a blessing," I suggested. "A brief respite from the darker aspects of human nature." Holmes sniffed contemptuously. "A blessing? My dear Watson, inactivity is a curse to a brain such as mine. Without fuel, the engine chokes and falters. Without data, the faculties become dull, and—" He was interrupted by a sharp knock at our door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression betraying unusual excitement. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "He seems most distressed, and insists the matter is urgent." Holmes's entire demeanor underwent an instantaneous transformation. The languid posture vanished, replaced by alert attentiveness, the distant gaze now sharp with anticipation. "Show him up at once, Mrs. Hudson," he said with sudden animation. As our landlady departed, Holmes turned to me with the smile of a connoisseur who has just been offered a rare vintage. "Observe the timing, Watson. At the very moment of my complaint, Fortune sends us a visitor. Let us hope his problem proves worthy of our attention." Moments later, we heard rapid footsteps upon the stairs, and Mrs. Hudson ushered in our visitor. He was a young man of perhaps 28, tall and well-formed, though at present his handsome features were distorted by evident anxiety. His clothes were of excellent quality, if somewhat dampened by the rain, and his manner bespoke education and breeding. Yet there was a wildness in his eyes that suggested he had not slept properly for several nights. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, glancing rapidly between us. "I am he," my friend replied, gesturing toward an armchair. "Pray be seated, Mr. Darkwater." "Edward Darkwater," our visitor supplied, sinking into the offered chair. His hands, I noted, trembled slightly as he removed his gloves. "You have come from Yorkshire, I perceive," remarked Holmes casually. Our visitor started. "How could you possibly—" Holmes waved away the question with a flicker of impatience. "The mud upon your boots is distinctive, a particular clay found principally in certain parts of Yorkshire. You have travelled by express train this morning, having spent a wakeful night prior to your journey." "That is remarkable, Mr. Holmes." "Elementary. The train timetable is visible in your coat pocket, with the early morning Yorkshire Express circled. As for your sleepless night, the shadows beneath your eyes and the manner in which you have twice stifled a yawn since entering the room tell their own tale. But these matters are incidental. You did not travel to London merely to have me deduce your movements. Tell me what brings you here with such urgency." Edward Darkwater drew a deep breath as though gathering his courage. "Mr. Holmes, I come to you because my family is being decimated by what I can only describe as a supernatural agency." I observed a gleam of interest in my friend's eyes. Holmes had always displayed a particular fascination for cases that appeared to involve elements of the fantastic or the occult, invariably revealing the mundane truths behind such seeming mysteries. "Pray continue," Holmes urged, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "My family seat, Darkwater Estate, lies in the North Riding. It has been in our possession for over 3 centuries. Within the past year, 3 members of my family have died under identical, inexplicable circumstances." Darkwater paused, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "Each of them, shortly before their death, reported seeing the apparition of a bride in flowing white robes moving through the corridors of the house." "And you believe this spectre to be responsible for their deaths?" Holmes inquired, his tone betraying neither skepticism nor credulity. "I know how it sounds, Mr. Holmes," Darkwater replied, with a touch of defiance. "I am not a superstitious man. I was educated at Cambridge and consider myself a rational being, but I can find no other explanation for what has transpired." "Kindly furnish us with the particulars," said Holmes, settling back into his chair. "The first to die was my cousin Geoffrey, who was visiting last Christmas. He was found one morning in his bed, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The doctor declared it heart failure, but Geoffrey was only 30 and in excellent health. A week before his death he had come to breakfast white as a sheet, claiming to have seen a woman in bridal attire outside his bedroom window on the 2nd floor. Darkwater continued, his voice gathering strength as he spoke. 5 months later, my Aunt Agatha suffered a similar fate. She, too, had reported seeing the spectral bride in the library. The most recent victim was my uncle, the master of Darkwater Estate, found dead 3 weeks ago. The night before he had burst into the drawing room shaking violently, saying he had encountered the bride on the grand staircase. "And the medical examinations revealed nothing suspicious?" Holmes inquired. "Nothing beyond heart failure, apparently induced by extreme fright," Darkwater replied. "Mr. Holmes, my sister Charlotte remains at the estate, along with my cousin Richard, who now stands to inherit. I fear for their safety, yet I cannot persuade them to leave." Holmes rose suddenly and began to pace the room, his lean figure vibrant with renewed energy. "Tell me, Mr. Darkwater, is there any legend attached to your family home that might explain this apparition? Some tale of a bride who met a tragic fate, perhaps?" Darkwater nodded grimly. "Indeed there is, though I had scarcely credited it until now. The story goes that in the early part of the last century a young woman was to be married to the heir of Darkwater. On the eve of the wedding she discovered his infidelity, and in her despair took her own life. It is said her spirit wanders the halls, bringing death to those of Darkwater blood." "Most interesting," Holmes murmured. "Is there a portrait of this unfortunate young woman in the house?" "There is a portrait of my great-grandmother from that period in the long gallery," Darkwater replied with evident surprise. "But how did you know?" Holmes smiled enigmatically. It was a natural inquiry. "Watson, I believe we shall be journeying to Yorkshire tomorrow. The 9:15 train, if it suits you, Mr. Darkwater." Our visitor's face lit with relief. "Then you will take the case?" "It presents certain features of interest," Holmes replied. "I cannot promise results, but I shall certainly investigate." As Edward Darkwater departed with renewed hope, I turned to my friend. "You seem intrigued by this ghostly business, Holmes." "Not by the ghost, Watson," he replied, his eyes gleaming, "but by the fact that someone wishes the Darkwater family to believe in one. When a phantom bride begins to commit murder, we may be certain that very human hands are at work. The game is afoot, my dear fellow, and I suspect it shall prove a three-pipe problem at the very least. Chapter 2. Arrival at Darkwater. The following morning saw us ensconced in a first-class railway carriage, speeding northward through the English countryside. The weather had done little to improve since the previous day, and sheets of rain lashed against the windows, transforming the passing landscape into a blur of sodden greens and browns. Holmes sat opposite me, his keen eyes fixed upon the changing scenery, though I knew his mind was elsewhere, already grappling with the peculiar problem presented by our client. Edward Darkwater had met us at the station as arranged, his demeanour somewhat calmer than during his visit to Baker Street, though anxiety still lined his youthful features. He had brought with him several newspapers which contained brief accounts of his uncle's death, but they offered little beyond the bare facts we already knew. The local physician, Dr. Winters, is quite adamant that my uncle died of heart failure, Darkwater explained as our journey progressed, though he admits to being puzzled by the extreme terror evident on his face. "And the previous victims displayed similar expressions?" Holmes inquired, his eyes never leaving the window. "Identical," our companion confirmed. "Cousin Geoffrey's face was so contorted that the servants who found him were nearly as frightened as he must have been in his final moments." "Most suggestive," murmured Holmes. "Tell me, Mr. Darkwater, who stands to benefit most directly from these deaths?" A look of discomfort crossed our client's face. "My cousin Richard is now the heir, since my uncle left no children. But I assure you, Mr. Holmes, Richard is beyond suspicion. He was in London when Geoffrey died, and at a house party in Derbyshire during my aunt's final night." "And your uncle's death?" "Richard was at Darkwater then, but so were a dozen others, including myself. We had gathered for the reading of my aunt's will." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "I cast no aspersions, Mr. Darkwater. I merely seek to establish the facts. And the staff at Darkwater, have there been any recent additions?" "None for many years. Mrs. Fairweather, our governess, has been with the family for over 3 decades. The butler, Graves, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Bentley, have served nearly as long. The other staff are similarly long-standing." "This Mrs. Fairweather, she would have been present during all 3 deaths?" "Yes, though I fail to see how that is relevant. She is a most devoted servant, and has been like family to us all." "Everything is relevant until proven otherwise," Holmes replied with a thin smile. "Now tell me more about the structure of Darkwater itself. It is an old house, I gather." "Parts date back to Tudor times, though much was rebuilt in my great-grandfather's day. It is somewhat of a labyrinth, wings added over centuries, passages that seem to lead nowhere, rooms that connect in unexpected ways. My sister Charlotte says it is a house of secrets, though she has a fanciful nature." "All old houses have their secrets," Holmes remarked, "some more deadly than others." The remainder of our journey passed in relative silence, Holmes lost in contemplation, while Darkwater gazed anxiously out at the steadily worsening weather. By the time we reached the small station where we were to disembark, The rain had transformed into a heavy, swirling mist that clung to the hills and obscured the landscape. A carriage awaited us, and soon we were travelling through narrow country lanes, the horses' hooves muffled by the thick fog that surrounded us. As we climbed steadily upward into the hills, the mist occasionally parted to reveal glimpses of wild, wind-swept moors stretching into the distance. Darkwater lies in a valley beyond the next ridge, our client informed us. The estate encompasses some 2,000 acres, much of it moorland. We are rather isolated, especially in inclement weather. As if to emphasize his point, a low roll of thunder sounded in the distance, and the wind rose suddenly, rattling the carriage windows. I confess that the desolate surroundings, combined with the grim nature of our investigation, had begun to affect my spirits. Holmes, however, appeared invigorated by the wild scenery and forbidding conditions. "Excellent weather for ghosts, eh, Watson?" he remarked, with a gleam in his eye. I was saved from replying by Darkwater's sudden exclamation. "There it is! Darkwater Estate." The mists had parted momentarily to reveal our destination, and I could not suppress a slight shiver at the sight. In the valley below us stood a great stone mansion, its grey walls rising from the surrounding darkness like a fortress of old. A small lake lay before it, its surface rippled by the wind and darkened by the overhanging clouds, giving the estate its appropriate name. Wings of varying architectural styles extended from the central building, speaking to the generations that had added to the original structure. Even from this distance, I could see numerous chimneys, turrets, and oddly placed windows that gave the house an unsettling, almost watchful quality. "It is not always so forbidding," Darkwater said apologetically, noting my expression. "In summer, with the gardens in bloom and sunlight on the lake, it can be quite beautiful." "I find it impressive precisely as it is," Holmes remarked. "A house of character, with history etched into its very stones." The carriage made its way down the winding drive, between ancient oaks whose gnarled branches seemed to reach toward us like spectral hands. As we drew closer to the house, I observed details that had been obscured from a distance. The intricate stonework around the windows, the worn steps leading to the massive oak door, the family crest carved above the entrance. A figure appeared on the steps as our carriage came to a halt. A tall, elderly woman in a severe black dress, her grey hair pulled tightly back beneath a small cap. Her posture was remarkably straight for one of her years, and her features, though lined with age, retained a certain handsome quality. "Mrs. Fairweather," Darkwater explained as he alighted. "Our governess, though she has not had charges to govern since my sister and I came of age. Now she serves as a sort of companion and unofficial housekeeper." The woman descended the steps to greet us, her movements displaying a grace that belied her years. "Mr. Edward, we had begun to worry. The weather is turning most foul." Her voice was cultured, with the faintest trace of a northern accent softening her words. She turned to us with a polite inclination of her head. "You must be Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson. We are most grateful for your coming." There was something in her direct gaze that impressed me, a calm intelligence and quiet dignity that spoke of a woman who had seen much in her long years of service. "Mrs. Fairweather has been the heart of Darkwater for as long as I can remember," Darkwater said, with evident affection. "She knows every corner of the house and every skeleton in our family closet. Isn't that so, Mrs. Fairweather?" "Every family has its secrets, Mr. Edward," she replied with a small smile, "though some are best left undisturbed." She turned back to us. "Please, gentlemen, come inside. I've had rooms prepared, and tea will be served in the library once you've refreshed yourselves." The interior of Darkwater was as impressive as its exterior. A great hall with a vaulted ceiling, oak panelling darkened by age, and a massive fireplace where logs crackled and spat. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow us as we crossed the flagstone floor. A grand staircase rose at the far end, its banister intricately carved with figures I could not quite make out in the dim light. "Your luggage will be taken to your rooms," Mrs. Fairweather informed us. "Mr. Holmes, I have placed you in the east wing, which offers a view of both the lake and the gardens. Dr. Watson, you are adjacent. I trust you will be comfortable." As she spoke, I noticed Holmes's gaze darting about the hall, taking in every detail, the arrangement of the furniture, the placement of doors, the angles of the corridors leading off the main space. I knew he was already constructing a mental map of the house, which would no doubt prove essential in the days to come. "This is where my uncle claimed to have seen the bride," Darkwater said quietly, gesturing toward the grand staircase. "He was descending for dinner when he encountered her on the landing. He ran into the drawing-room in such a state that we thought he had suffered an apoplexy. By morning, he was dead." "Most interesting," Holmes murmured, his eyes now fixed on the staircase, examining it from various angles. "And the windows, they reflect light in quite a remarkable manner, do they not?" Before Darkwater could respond, a door opened at the far end of the hall, and a young woman entered, slender, fair-haired, with a delicate beauty enhanced rather than diminished by the evident anxiety in her expression. "Edward, thank heavens you've returned safely," she exclaimed, coming forward to embrace our client. "My sister, Charlotte," Darkwater explained to us. "Charlotte, this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes and his colleague, Dr. Watson, who have kindly agreed to investigate our situation." The young woman turned to us, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Then you believe there may be an explanation beyond the supernatural, Mr. Holmes? I confess, living in this house has become increasingly difficult. One cannot help feeling that someone is watching, waiting. I have yet to encounter a mystery that did not yield to rational investigation, Miss Darkwater," Holmes replied kindly, "though I shall require your complete candor regarding all that has occurred within these walls." A sudden crash of thunder directly overhead made Charlotte start visibly. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon had finally broken, and rain began to lash against the leaded windows with renewed vigor. "A proper Yorkshire welcome," remarked Mrs. Fairweather with dry humour. "Come, let me show you to your rooms before the weather brings down another of the old chimneys. We've had quite enough excitement at Darkwater without architectural collapses." As we followed her up the grand staircase, I found myself glancing involuntarily at the shadows cast by the flickering wall sconces, half expecting to glimpse a white-clad figure drifting through the gloom. While I knew Holmes would find a rational explanation for the deaths that had occurred, there was something about Darkwater that inspired a most irrational unease. The house itself seemed to breathe with ancient secrets, and I could not shake the sensation that, from behind one of the many portraits, unseen eyes were watching our progress with calculating interest. Chapter 3. The Family History. After refreshing ourselves from the journey, Holmes and I descended to the library where tea had been laid out before a crackling fire. The library was a magnificent room, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes interspersed with alcoves containing busts of long-dead philosophers and poets. Two tall windows, now streaked with rain, overlooked the darkened lake, while a smaller window in an adjacent wall faced what I presumed to be the gardens, though little could be seen in the gathering gloom. Edward Darkwater awaited us, along with his sister Charlotte, and a young man who was introduced as their cousin, Richard Darkwater. Richard was a handsome fellow of about 30, with the same fair hair as Charlotte, but with a more robust build than the slender Edward. His manner was cordial enough, though I detected a certain reserve in his greeting, as if he were sceptical about the necessity of our presence. "Mr. Holmes, said he after the introductions had been made. "While I appreciate Edward's concern, I cannot help wondering if you have been brought here on something of a fool's errand. These unfortunate deaths, tragic as they are, surely have natural explanations." "You do not subscribe to the legend of the Phantom Bride, then?" Holmes inquired, accepting a cup of tea from Charlotte. Richard gave a short laugh. "Hardly. I was educated at Oxford, Mr. Holmes. I deal in facts, not fairy tales." "And yet," Holmes remarked, "I have observed that the most rational minds often become susceptible to superstition when confronted with the inexplicable." "You were present when your uncle died, I understand?" A shadow crossed Richard's face. "I was, and I will admit that his terror was genuine enough. Whatever he believed he saw that night affected him profoundly." "But you yourself have never glimpsed this apparition." "Never, though I've resided at Darkwater for extended periods throughout my life." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic gesture I knew so well. "Tell me more about this legend. I should like to hear it in detail." It was Charlotte who responded, her voice dropping almost to a whisper, despite her brother's reassuring presence beside her. "The story dates back to 1824, she began. "My great-grandfather, William Darkwater, was engaged to marry a young woman named Eleanor Blackwood. She was the daughter of a neighbouring landowner, and the marriage was to unite the two estates. On the eve of their wedding, Eleanor discovered that William had been involved with another woman, some say a servant girl, others claim she was a relative of Eleanor's own family. In her despair, Eleanor drowned herself in the lake." "A not uncommon tale," Holmes observed. "Many great houses boast similar legends." "There is more," Charlotte continued. "It is said that Eleanor vowed with her dying breath that no Darkwater would ever know happiness, that she would return to claim what was rightfully hers. Since then, there have been occasional reports of a woman in wedding attire seen wandering the corridors or grounds, but never, until this past year, has her appearance been followed so swiftly by death." "And the portrait your brother mentioned to me in London, that of your great-grandmother, is it here in the library?" "No," Edward replied. "It hangs in the long gallery on the second floor. Would you care to see it now?" "Presently," Holmes said. "First, I should like to establish a few more facts. These sightings, Geoffrey, Agatha, and your uncle, did they all report seeing the bride in different locations?" "Yes," Edward confirmed. "Geoffrey saw her outside his bedroom window on the second floor of the West Wing. Aunt Agatha encountered her here in the library, emerging from between the shelves, she claimed. And Uncle Henry, as I mentioned, met her on the grand staircase." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "Most curious. And no pattern to the timing? No anniversaries or significant dates?" "None that we have discerned," Edward answered. "Geoffrey died in December, Aunt Agatha in May, and Uncle Henry just 3 weeks ago, in early October." "Were there any unusual occurrences preceding these sightings? Changes in routine, unexpected visitors, unusual sounds in the night?" The three Darkwaters exchanged glances. It was Richard who finally spoke. "There is one thing, though I'm not sure of its relevance. The week before Geoffrey's death, several of the servants reported hearing strange noises from the unused north wing, scraping sounds as if furniture were being moved about. Uncle Henry investigated but found nothing amiss." "And before the other deaths?" Holmes pressed. "Similar reports before Aunt Agatha's experience," Charlotte said quietly. "Though by then everyone attributed them to the ghost, and few were willing to investigate." "Quite understandable," Holmes murmured. "Now, regarding the structure of the house itself, Edward mentioned that parts date back to Tudor times. Has the house been significantly renovated or altered over the years?" "My great-grandfather made substantial changes," Richard replied. He added the west and east wings and completely redesigned the grand staircase. He was something of an architectural enthusiast with rather eclectic tastes. He gestured toward a framed architectural drawing hanging on the wall. That's the original plan for his renovations, though I believe he made several modifications during the actual construction. Holmes rose and moved to examine the drawing, his keen eyes studying it intently. Most interesting. The proportions are unusual, particularly in the relationship between the main hall and the connecting corridors. Our great-grandfather was influenced by his travels in Italy, Charlotte explained. He incorporated elements of Palladian design, much to the consternation of his more traditional neighbours. Did he, by chance, have an interest in optics or theatrical design? Holmes inquired, still examining the drawing. Edward looked surprised. As a matter of fact, yes. The ballroom, which we seldom use now, was designed with a small stage for amateur theatricals. Great-grandfather was quite enthusiastic about such entertainments. But how did you know? A mere conjecture based on certain elements of the design, Holmes replied vaguely. I should very much like to see this ballroom at some point. As we continued our discussion, Mrs. Fairweather entered with a fresh pot of tea and additional refreshments. I noticed how deferentially the Darkwaters treated her, not as a servant, but almost as an elder family member. She, in turn, displayed an obvious affection for them, particularly for Richard, whom she addressed with special warmth. Mrs. Fairweather, Holmes said as she arranged the tea things, I understand you have been with the Darkwater family for many years. You must have a unique perspective on recent events. The elderly woman straightened, her dignified bearing evident as she considered Holmes's question. I have served 3 generations of Darkwaters, Mr. Holmes, and have seen my share of sorrows and joys within these walls. These recent tragedies have been most distressing, particularly for the younger members of the family. She glanced fondly at Charlotte, who gave her a grateful smile in return. And the legend of the bride, have you ever personally experienced anything that might lend credence to it? Holmes inquired. I'm not given to flights of fancy, Mr. Holmes, she replied with a slight smile, though I will say that Darkwater, like any house of its age, has its peculiarities. Draughts that extinguish candles when all windows are closed, sounds that carry through the walls in unexpected ways, shadows that play tricks on even the steadiest minds. Most illuminating, said Holmes. One final question, if I may. Are there any records, journals, or family documents that might shed light on the original incident, Eleanor Blackwood's tragic end? Edward nodded. There are family journals and correspondence in the estate office. I can make them available to you tomorrow. There's also a record of the renovations commissioned by our great-grandfather, including the mirrors he had installed in the ballroom. Holmes's eyes sharpened with sudden interest. Mirrors, you say? Yes, an entire set designed specifically for the space. They were quite remarkable, according to the accounts, supposedly creating unusual optical effects during performances. Most have been removed or covered over the years as the ballroom fell into disuse. I should very much like to examine any documentation regarding these mirrors, Holmes said, his voice betraying an excitement I had come to recognize as the sign of a potentially significant discovery. As our conversation continued, I became aware that the storm outside had intensified. Wind howled around the ancient stones of Darkwater, and rain lashed against the windows with renewed fury. Occasionally, a particularly violent gust would send a moan echoing down one of the many chimneys, producing a sound not unlike a human cry. The weather reports suggest this storm will continue through the night, Richard observed, glancing toward the windows. You've chosen an atmospheric time for your visit, Mr. Holmes? On the contrary, Holmes replied with a thin smile, I believe the weather may prove most advantageous to our investigation. Certain conditions, particularly involving light, sound, and shadow, may be essential to understanding the phenomena reported by your unfortunate relatives." Charlotte shivered visibly. "You speak as though you expect the bride to make an appearance during your stay, Mr. Holmes." "I make no predictions, Miss Darkwater," he answered gently. "But I have found that when the stage is set for a performance, the players rarely disappoint. Now, if you would be so kind, I should like to see that portrait of your great-grandmother before dinner." As we rose to leave the library, I caught a curious exchange of glances between Richard and Mrs. Fairweather, a look I could not quite interpret, but which suggested some unspoken understanding between them. Holmes, I noted, had also observed this silent communication, though he made no comment upon it, as we followed Edward and Charlotte toward the long gallery and its secrets. Chapter 4. The First Sighting. The portrait of the elder Mrs. Darkwater hung in solitary splendour at the far end of the long gallery, illuminated by a strategically placed oil lamp that cast a warm glow upon the painted features. Holmes stood before it in silent contemplation for several minutes, his keen eyes absorbing every detail of the canvas. The woman depicted was young and fair, with the same delicate features that Charlotte had inherited, though there was a certain determination in the set of her mouth that spoke of a stronger character than her descendants. "A remarkable resemblance between your sister and your great-grandmother," Holmes observed to Edward, who nodded in agreement. "The Darkwater features tend to reappear with each generation," he replied, "though I'm told I favour my mother's family more than the Darkwater line." "And this was painted when?" "Shortly after her marriage to your great-grandfather, I presume?" Holmes inquired, his gaze still fixed on the portrait. "Yes, in 1825. The year after Eleanor Blackwood's death. They married rather hastily following that tragedy, which caused some scandal at the time." "Interesting," murmured Holmes. "The artist has captured a certain watchfulness in her expression, almost as if she guards a secret." He stepped closer to examine the background of the portrait, which depicted a partial view of Darkwater's grand staircase. "The renovations were already complete by this time." "Just barely," Charlotte answered. "Great-grandfather rushed them through in time for the wedding. Some said indecently quickly after poor Eleanor's death." Holmes made no reply to this, but continued his examination of the portrait, paying particular attention to the play of light and shadow in the painting. Finally he turned away, his expression thoughtful. "A most illuminating portrait," he remarked. "Now I believe dinner awaits us, and I confess the journey has given me an appetite." Dinner that evening was served in a modest dining room rather than the grand formal chamber, which Edward explained was now used only for special occasions. Mrs. Fairweather did not join us at table, though I noted that a place had been laid for Richard's sister, Eliza Darkwater, who had been delayed by the storm but was expected to arrive later that evening. The meal was excellent, simple country fare, but of the finest quality, served by the elderly butler Graves, whose dignified bearing and silent efficiency spoke of decades of service. The conversation remained light, with no further mention of the phantom bride, though I could not help noticing that Charlotte started nervously at each crack of thunder or particular fierce gust of wind that rattled the windows. It was as we were enjoying our port following the meal that Edward raised the subject of the dinner party he had planned for the following evening. "I hope you gentlemen don't mind," he said, "but I've invited a few neighbours to dine tomorrow night. I thought it might be useful for your investigation, Mr. Holmes, to meet some of the local people who have known the family for years." "A most thoughtful arrangement," Holmes replied. "One often gleans unexpected insights from such gatherings." "It will be nothing elaborate," Charlotte added. "Just the vicar and his wife, Dr. Winters, who attended our uncle, and Sir William and Lady Blackwood from the neighbouring estate. Blackwood? I inquired, recalling the name from the tragic tale we had heard earlier. Distant cousins of the original Eleanor Blackwood, Richard explained. Their family has owned the adjacent property for generations. In fact, had Eleanor and our great-grandfather married as planned, the two estates would have been united. A considerable loss to your family's holdings, then, Holmes observed casually. Richard's expression tightened slightly. The Darkwater estate has never lacked for land, Mr. Holmes, though I believe my great-grandfather did extend the property considerably through other, more successful marriages later in his life. After the death of your great-grandmother? Holmes inquired. Yes, she died young, childbed fever, I believe, just after giving birth to my grandfather. Great-grandfather remarried twice more and had several other children, though only my grandfather's line survived to the present generation. The conversation might have continued in this vein had it not been interrupted by the arrival of the butler, who announced that Miss Eliza Darkwater had arrived and was being shown to her room. "Excellent!" Richard exclaimed, his expression brightening considerably. "I was beginning to worry about her travelling in such weather." "Your sister lives elsewhere?" Holmes inquired. "In York, where she teaches music," Richard replied. "Though she visits frequently. She's particularly fond of Charlotte's company." Shortly thereafter we adjourned to the drawing-room, where a fire had been lit against the increasing chill of the evening. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had intensified, with lightning now joining the thunder in a dramatic display visible through the tall windows. It was as we sat enjoying the warmth of the fire that Richard suddenly rose from his seat with an exclamation of shock. His face had gone deathly pale, and he was staring fixedly at the window behind Holmes and myself. "Good God!" he gasped. "There, by the old yew tree." We all turned to follow his gaze. Through the rain-streaked glass and the darkness beyond, I could just make out the ancient tree he had indicated, its twisted form illuminated momentarily by a flash of lightning. For an instant, though I could not be certain, I thought I glimpsed a pale figure moving beneath its branches, a suggestion of flowing white quickly swallowed by the darkness. Holmes was on his feet in an instant, moving swiftly to the window for a better view. "When exactly did you see this figure, Mr. Darkwater? And what precisely did you observe?" Richard's voice was unsteady as he replied. "Just as the lightning flashed, a woman in white, moving between the yew tree and the rose garden, she seemed to be looking up at this very window." Without another word, Holmes strode from the room. I hastened after him, followed by Edward, while Charlotte remained behind with the still, visibly shaken Richard. We found Holmes in the entrance hall, pulling on his overcoat. "You mean to go outside in this weather?" Edward asked, incredulously. "The trail will grow cold quickly in this rain," Holmes replied tersely. "Watson, bring your revolver if you would be so kind." "Surely you don't think," Edward began, but Holmes cut him off with a raised hand. "I think nothing until I have facts, Mr. Darkwater. Now, is there a side entrance that would give us quicker access to the area where this figure was seen?" Edward led us through a corridor to a small door that opened onto a flagstone path leading toward the gardens. The moment Holmes opened the door, we were met with a blast of wind and rain that nearly drove us back. Undeterred, Holmes stepped out into the storm, his tall figure immediately becoming indistinct in the darkness. I followed, grateful for my sturdy boots and the heavy overcoat I had thought to bring. The wind howled around us, snatching at our clothes and making conversation all but impossible. Holmes moved with purpose, following the path toward the ancient yew tree that Richard had indicated. The lightning continued to flash overhead, providing brief glimpses of our surroundings. The sodden lawn, the dripping roses, the the looming bulk of Darkwater itself with its many windows glowing warmly against the night. When we reached the yew tree, Holmes produced a small but powerful pocket lamp which he directed at the ground around its gnarled trunk. Despite the pouring rain, he examined the area meticulously, his face set in lines of intense concentration. I watched as he moved methodically in an expanding circle from the tree, his eyes missing nothing. After perhaps 10 minutes of this careful search, during which Edward and I stood uselessly by, increasingly soaked to the skin, Holmes gave a small exclamation of satisfaction. He bent down near a rosebush some yards from the yew tree and carefully extracted something from among its thorny branches. "What is it?" I called over the howling wind. Holmes did not immediately answer, but continued his examination of the area for several more minutes, before finally indicating that we should return to the house. It was only when we were once again within the shelter of the corridor, dripping water onto the polished floor, that he opened his hand to reveal what appeared to be a fine white thread several inches in length. "Found caught on a rose-thorn," he explained, carefully winding the thread around a small piece of card, which he then placed in his pocket. A common enough material, but its presence in that particular location is suggestive. "You believe it came from the figure Richard saw?" Edward asked. "It is a possibility I shall consider," Holmes replied non-committally. "Though I make no claims at present. Now I suggest we change into dry attire before rejoining the others. I am particularly interested in speaking with your cousin further about exactly what he observed." When we returned to the drawing-room, we found that Richard had recovered somewhat from his shock and was now engaged in earnest conversation with a newcomer, a slender young woman with fair hair similar to his own, whom I took to be his sister, Eliza. She rose as we entered, regarding Holmes with evident curiosity. "Miss Darkwater, I presume?" Holmes said with a slight bow. "I apologize for our damp appearance. We have been investigating your brother's most interesting sighting." "Richard has just been telling me about it," she replied, her voice cultured and pleasant. "How extraordinary that the phenomenon should manifest itself during your very first evening at Darkwater." "Extraordinary indeed," Holmes agreed, though I detected a note in his voice that suggested he found the timing more suspicious than extraordinary. "Mr. Darkwater, would you be so kind as to describe again exactly what you saw, in as much detail as possible?" Richard hesitated, glancing toward his sister as if seeking support. "As I said, it was a figure in white, a woman, moving between the yew tree and the rose garden. Her face was indistinct, but the white gown was unmistakable. She appeared to look directly up at the window, and then she was gone." "And this is the first time you personally have seen such a figure?" Holmes pressed. "The very first," Richard confirmed. "Though after what happened to Uncle Henry, I confess it has affected me more deeply than I would have expected." Holmes said nothing more on the subject, but I knew him well enough to recognize the gleam in his eye, the look that indicated he had found something of genuine interest. As the evening progressed, he engaged the family in seemingly casual conversation about the history of the house, the routines of the household, and the relationships between various family members. To a casual observer, it might have appeared as mere social discourse, but I knew he was methodically gathering information, filing away each detail for later consideration. It was nearly midnight when we finally retired, the storm still raging around Darkwater's ancient walls. As Holmes bade me good night outside my chamber door, he paused. "Lock your door tonight, Watson," he said quietly, "and keep your revolver close at hand. I suspect our phantom bride may not restrict her activities to the gardens." With that enigmatic warning, he disappeared into his own room, leaving me to ponder what insights he had already gleaned from this most unusual case, and what dangers might await us in the nights to come at Darkwater Estate. Chapter 5. Secrets of the Estate. The morning following Richard's startling encounter brought calmer weather, though the skies remained leaden and occasional showers pattered against the windows of Darkwater. I found Holmes already abroad when I descended for breakfast, Graves informing me that my friend had departed at first light to examine the grounds. By the time I had finished my meal, Holmes had returned, his trouser cuffs muddied, but his eyes bright with that particular gleam I had come to associate with progress in an investigation. "Ah, Watson," he greeted me as he entered the breakfast room. "I trust you slept well despite our hostess's nocturnal wanderings." "Hostess?" I inquired, puzzled. "I heard nothing in the night." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "No? How curious. Between 2 and 3 o'clock there was considerable movement in the corridor outside our rooms, soft footsteps, but quite distinct." Before I could respond, Edward Darkwater entered, looking somewhat haggard, as if he had passed a restless night. "Mr. Holmes, I've had the estate office unlocked as promised. You'll find all the family records there, including the journals and correspondence you inquired about." "Excellent," Holmes replied. "I am particularly interested in the documentation regarding your great-grandfather's architectural modifications and those mirrors you mentioned." Edward nodded. "You'll find detailed records of the renovations. My great-grandfather was meticulous in his documentation." After breakfast, Edward led us to the estate office, a wood-panelled room filled with ledgers, correspondence files, and architectural drawings. Holmes immediately set to work, poring over the documents with intense concentration. For my part, I examined a series of family photographs displayed on one wall, noting the progression of Darkwater generations. "Watson," Holmes called suddenly, "look at this." He was holding an architectural drawing that appeared to show a cross-section of the house. His finger traced what seemed to be a narrow passage running between the main walls. "A servant's corridor?" I suggested. "More than that," Holmes replied. "Note how it connects these specific rooms, those where the apparition was reportedly seen, and observe these small apertures indicated here and here." Edward, who had been sorting through some papers at a desk, came to examine the drawing. "I had no idea such passages existed," he admitted, "though it would explain certain peculiarities, how sounds sometimes carry between rooms that should be quite separate." "Indeed," said Holmes. "Mr. Darkwater, with your permission, I should like to locate the entrances to these passages. They may prove crucial to our investigation." With Edward's assistance, we began a methodical search of the house. It was in the library, behind a particularly massive bookcase, that we discovered the first hidden door, a narrow entrance, cleverly disguised, that swung open to reveal a dusty corridor barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. "Remarkable," Edward breathed. "To think this has been here all along, unknown to us." Holmes produced his pocket lamp and stepped into the passage. I followed, noting the accumulated dust on the floor, which bore distinct marks of recent disturbance. "Someone has used this passage within the past month," Holmes remarked, his keen eyes examining the floor. "A woman, judging by the size and pattern of the footprints." We followed the narrow passage as it wound through the interior of the house, discovering small apertures cleverly disguised as decorative features that allowed one to observe the rooms beyond without being seen. One such viewing point overlooked the very spot in the library where Aunt Agatha had reported seeing the spectral bride. As we continued our exploration, we eventually emerged into a large, open space that I initially took to be a storeroom, until Holmes's lamp revealed faded murals on the walls and a raised platform at one end. "The old ballroom," Edward explained. "It hasn't been used since my grandfather's time. We keep it locked now, The floor is no longer entirely safe. Holmes moved carefully across the dusty floor toward the platform, his lamp illuminating what appeared to be an intricate system of ropes and pulleys attached to the ceiling above. "What is this?" I inquired. "Unless I am much mistaken," Holmes replied, "it is a mechanism for theatrical effects, quite sophisticated for its time. Your great-grandfather appears to have been something of an innovator, Mr. Darkwater." As Holmes examined the pulley system, I became aware of a presence in the doorway behind us. Turning, I saw Mrs. Fairweather watching our activities with a guarded expression. "I see you've discovered some of Darkwater's secrets," she remarked, her voice betraying neither approval nor concern. "Mr. Edward, your cousin Richard has been looking for you. The vicar has arrived early and is waiting in the drawing-room." "Thank you, Mrs. Fairweather," Edward replied. "I'll go to him at once." He turned to us apologetically. "Please continue your exploration, gentlemen. I shall rejoin you as soon as I can." After Edward had departed, Holmes turned his full attention to Mrs. Fairweather. "You seem unsurprised by our discoveries," he observed. The elderly woman smiled faintly. "I have served at Darkwater for over 30 years, Mr. Holmes. Very little about this house remains unknown to me." "Including these passages?" Holmes inquired casually. "They were used by the servants in earlier days," she replied, "though they've fallen into disuse in modern times." "All of them?" Holmes pressed. "The dust suggests otherwise." Mrs. Fairweather regarded him steadily. "The passages are occasionally useful for moving about the house discreetly, particularly when one wishes to avoid disturbing the family." Holmes nodded, accepting this explanation without comment. After Mrs. Fairweather had departed, he continued his examination of the ballroom, paying particular attention to several large draped objects positioned at strategic points around the room. "Mirrors," he explained, pulling back one of the dust covers to reveal a tarnished but still impressive-looking glass in an ornate frame, positioned to create specific optical effects when combined with the pulley system and strategic lighting. "You believe these are connected to the apparitions?" I asked. "It is a theory worth considering," Holmes replied, "though I require more data before drawing definitive conclusions." As we made our way back through the hidden passage, Holmes paused at several junctions, noting how each branch led to different key areas of the house, including, significantly, the garden door through which we had pursued the phantom bride the previous evening. "Watson," he said quietly as we emerged once more into the library, "I believe it would be most informative to learn more about Mrs. Fairweather's past. Perhaps you might engage the groundskeeper in conversation while I continue my examination of these family records. Country estates such as this run on gossip. The old retainers often know more about family secrets than the family themselves." I agreed to this plan, and while Holmes returned to the estate office, I made my way to the gardens where I found the elderly groundskeeper, Simmons, tending to the damage wrought by the previous night's storm. Chapter 6. The Second Appearance. My conversation with Simmons, the groundskeeper, proved most illuminating. The old man, initially reticent, became more forthcoming after I mentioned Holmes's reputation for discretion in sensitive family matters. We stood in the shelter of a small gardener's hut as another shower passed over, the rain drumming on the wooden roof, as Simmons spoke of his nearly 50 years of service to the Darkwaters. "Mrs. Fairweather wasn't always the dignified lady you see now," he informed me, his voice lowered despite our isolation. "She came to Darkwater as a young woman, not much more than a girl, really. Very pretty she was, too, with a resemblance to the family that some remarked upon." "A resemblance?" I inquired, recalling Holmes's interest in the portrait we had examined. Simmons nodded. Aye, though it wasn't spoken of openly, there were rumours, you understand, about her parentage. The old master, that would be Mr. Edward's grandfather, took a particular interest in her welfare, securing her position as under-housemaid initially, then arranging for her education. She rose from housemaid to governess then, I asked. In time, yes. She had ambitions, did Margaret Fairweather. Some said she had hopes of rising even further. His weathered face took on a knowing expression. There was talk, years back, of an understanding between her and young Master Richard's father. An engagement? Nothing so formal. But they were often seen together, and she had certain expectations by all accounts. Then the family arranged his marriage to Miss Elizabeth Harrington, Richard, and Miss Eliza's mother. It was quite the blow to Mrs. Fairweather, though she bore it with dignity. Yet she remained at Darkwater. Where else would she go? This has been her home since girlhood. And she's devoted to young Master Richard, raised him almost single-handedly after his parents died in that carriage accident when he was 7 years old. Our conversation might have continued further had we not been interrupted by the sudden appearance of Charlotte Darkwater hurrying through the gardens despite the rain, her face pale with agitation. "Dr. Watson," she called, "have you seen Mr. Holmes? Richard has been taken ill. He's asking for him most insistently." I hastened back to the house with Charlotte, learning on the way that Richard had collapsed shortly after luncheon, suffering from what appeared to be a severe nervous shock. We found him in his chamber, attended by Dr. Winters, who had been summoned from the village. Holmes was already present, standing by the window with a thoughtful expression. Richard lay upon his bed, his face ashen. Upon seeing us enter, he attempted to rise, only to be gently restrained by the doctor. "You must remain calm, Mr. Darkwater," Dr. Winters admonished. "Your heart has received quite a shock." "I must speak with Mr. Holmes," Richard insisted, his voice weak but determined. "It has happened again. I've seen her." Holmes approached the bedside, his manner reassuring yet alert. "Pray tell me exactly what you observed, Mr. Darkwater, and under what circumstances." Richard's eyes darted nervously about the room before he spoke. "I was returning from the village. I had ridden over to post some letters. As I approached the house, I saw a figure in white standing at my bedroom window. This very window." He gestured toward where Holmes had been standing. It was impossible, of course. I knew the room to be empty, and the figure appeared to be inside, looking out. When I entered the house and rushed upstairs, the room was indeed empty, but— He broke off, his breathing becoming rapid. "But," Holmes prompted gently. "The window was open, though I distinctly recall closing it this morning, and on the sill Again he faltered. "There was a trace of white fabric, was there not?" Holmes suggested. Richard looked startled. "Yes." "A small piece, as if torn from a garment." "How could you know?" Holmes did not answer directly, but turned to Dr. Winters. "Your diagnosis, doctor?" The physician, a grave man of middle years, shook his head. A severe shock to the nervous system, resulting in palpitations and respiratory distress, similar to what I observed in the late Mr. Darkwater before his unfortunate demise. I've administered a mild sedative, but Mr. Darkwater would be well advised to avoid further excitement. After the doctor had departed, with Charlotte accompanying him to the door, Holmes examined the window carefully. I observed him retrieve something from the sill with his forceps, presumably the scrap of fabric Richard had mentioned, and secure it in his pocket-case. "Mr. Darkwater," Holmes said, turning back to the bed, "I would strongly recommend that you remain in company for the rest of the day. Perhaps your sister might sit with you." "Eliza has gone to York on some errand," Richard replied weakly. "She is not expected back until dinner." Then perhaps Mrs. Fairweather, Holmes suggested. I understand she has been like family to you. A look of relief crossed Richard's face. Yes, she would be most suitable. Charlotte becomes too agitated in these situations, but Mrs. Fairweather has always had a calming influence. That evening, as storm clouds once again gathered over Darkwater, the dinner party proceeded as planned, though in a somewhat subdued fashion. Richard, against Dr. Winters's advice, insisted on joining us, supported by Mrs. Fairweather, who remained solicitously by his side. Charlotte, still visibly distressed by her cousin's experience, spoke little. The local guests, Sir William and Lady Blackwood, the vicar and his wife, and Dr. Winters, contributed to the conversation with discussions of local history and the recent unusual weather. I noticed that Holmes paid particular attention whenever the original Eleanor Blackwood was mentioned, especially to the reactions of the current Blackwoods. A tragic business, Sir William remarked, when the subject arose, though there are elements of the tale that have been embellished over time, I suspect. In what way? Holmes inquired casually. Well, the exact circumstances of poor Eleanor's death were never entirely clear. The official account states she drowned in the lake, but whether by accident or design remains a matter of conjecture. Sir William glanced at his wife before continuing. Family records suggest she may have been emotionally unstable. After dinner, as the storm broke in earnest overhead, Holmes excused himself briefly. I found him later in a dimly lit corridor conducting what appeared to be experiments with a small mirror and a candle. "Observe, Watson," he murmured as I approached. "The angle of reflection, combined with the architectural peculiarities of this house, creates most interesting optical effects. Stand here and tell me what you see in that far corner." I positioned myself as directed and gasped involuntarily. In the distant shadows at the corridor's end, a pale shape seemed to hover momentarily, indistinct but undeniably human in form. "A simple trick of light," Holmes explained, "yet most effective, particularly to an already agitated observer. Now imagine this effect multiplied and refined using the sophisticated equipment we discovered in the ballroom." We were interrupted by a sudden crash of thunder, so loud that it seemed to shake the very foundations of Darkwater. Almost immediately afterward came a piercing scream from the direction of the east wing. "Charlotte!" Holmes exclaimed, already moving swiftly down the corridor. We found Edward and several of the guests clustered outside Charlotte's chamber. Within, we discovered the young woman herself, pale as death and trembling violently, with Mrs. Fairweather attempting to administer smelling salts. "She was there," Charlotte gasped when she saw Holmes. "The bride, at the foot of my bed. When the thunder came, I opened my eyes and saw her standing there, looking down at me." "Did she speak?" Holmes asked intently. "Or make any movement?" "No," Charlotte whispered. "She simply vanished when I screamed." Holmes examined the room methodically, paying particular attention to the windows and the ornate mirror on Charlotte's dressing table. I observed him testing the angles of sight from various positions, his expression thoughtful. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fairweather had taken charge of the situation with remarkable composure, directing Edward to fetch brandy for his sister, while she efficiently arranged pillows and blankets to make Charlotte more comfortable. As the household gradually settled back into uneasy calm, I noted that Mrs. Fairweather displayed none of the agitation one might expect from a devoted family servant confronted with such disturbing events. Rather, she managed the crisis with a practiced efficiency that spoke of either exceptional self-control or, perhaps more tellingly, a lack of genuine surprise at the occurrence. Later that night, as Holmes and I conferred in his chamber, the storm continued its assault on Darkwater's ancient walls. Holmes spent several hours conducting tests with a series of mirrors and light sources, making detailed notes on the effects produced. Though he shared little of his conclusions, the intensity of his focus told me that he was assembling the pieces of this bizarre puzzle with increasing confidence. "We are approaching the heart of the matter, Watson," he remarked, as he finally set aside his experiments. "Tomorrow, I believe, we shall take decisive steps to bring this spectral bride into the realm of flesh and blood, where she rightfully belongs." Chapter 7. The Trap is Set. The following morning brought a temporary respite from the storms that had battered Darkwater. A pale sun struggled through dispersing clouds, casting weak shadows across the sodden grounds. I found Holmes already at work in the estate office, surrounded by architectural drawings, family correspondence, and several small mirrors which he had arranged at precise angles. "Ah, Watson," he greeted me without looking up from his calculations. "I trust you slept well despite our eventful evening?" "Well enough," I replied, though in truth, the night had been disturbed by strange dreams in which white-clad figures drifted through endless corridors. "Have you made progress?" Holmes tapped a pencil against the desk thoughtfully. "I believe I have assembled most of the pieces of our puzzle. What we lack now is the final connection, the motive that drives our phantom bride." "You are convinced, then, that the apparition is of human origin?" "Undoubtedly. The physical evidence alone, the thread from the garden, the fabric from Richard's windowsill, speaks to a corporeal presence. But it is the timing of the appearances that I find most suggestive." He gestured toward a timeline he had constructed, marking the dates of each sighting and subsequent death. "Note how they accelerate as the chain of inheritance grows shorter." Before he could elaborate further, Edward Darkwater entered, his face drawn with concern. "Mr. Holmes, my sister is much improved this morning, but I fear Richard has taken a turn for the worse. Dr. Winters has been summoned again." Holmes rose immediately. "Nothing fatal, I trust?" "A recurrence of the palpitations he experienced yesterday, though more severe. Dr. Winters speaks of transferring him to a hospital in York if his condition does not stabilize." "That would be most unfortunate," Holmes remarked, exchanging a significant glance with me. "Mr. Darkwater, I believe the time has come for more decisive action. With your permission, I should like to arrange a gathering this evening, an announcement of sorts that may help precipitate matters." Edward looked puzzled. "What kind of announcement?" "It concerns your cousin Richard. I had hoped to discuss it with him directly, but given his condition, I must ask for your assistance instead. I have reason to believe that Richard has recently formed an attachment, a romantic connection, with a young lady in London." This news appeared to surprise Edward considerably. "Richard? I had no idea. He has mentioned no such attachment to me or Charlotte." "Perhaps he wished to be certain of his feelings before making them known," Holmes suggested. "However, I believe that announcing this connection publicly this evening might prove illuminating." Though clearly mystified, Edward agreed to Holmes's request. As we left the estate office, I questioned Holmes about this supposed attachment. "Pure invention, Watson," he admitted quietly, "but a necessary catalyst. I need to provoke a specific reaction from our phantom bride, or rather from the person behind the manifestations." Holmes spent the remainder of the morning composing several telegrams which Edward arranged have sent from the village. One was addressed to Mycroft Holmes in London, requesting specific information about Mrs. Fairweather's family background. The others Holmes did not allow me to see. By afternoon, Richard had recovered sufficiently to join us for tea, though he remained pale and moved with evident caution. His sister Eliza hovered near him protectively, while Mrs. Fairweather prepared his tea with the specific amount of milk he preferred, a small gesture that spoke of long familiarity with his habits. It was during this gathering that Holmes, with casual deliberation, introduced the subject of Richard's supposed engagement. "I understand congratulations may soon be in order, Mr. Darkwater," he remarked. "A connection with the Hartley family of Belgravia would be most advantageous." Richard's expression of blank surprise quickly transformed into one of understanding as he caught Holmes's meaningful glance. "You are well informed, Mr. Holmes," he replied after a moment's hesitation, "though I had wished to keep the matter private until all arrangements were finalized." I observed Mrs. Fairweather's reaction carefully, as Holmes had instructed me to do. The teacup she was holding trembled almost imperceptibly, and a fleeting expression, too quickly masked to interpret with certainty, crossed her composed features. "This is wonderful news, Richard," Charlotte exclaimed, her face brightening. "Why did you not tell us sooner?" "As I said, nothing is yet formalized," Richard replied, warming to his role in Holmes's charade. "Miss Hartley and I have reached an understanding, but I intended to wait until the estate matters were settled before making a public announcement." Throughout this exchange, Holmes maintained an air of polite interest while surreptitiously observing each person's reaction. Mrs. Fairweather, after her initial almost undetectable response, maintained perfect composure, offering Richard appropriate congratulations in measured tones. As evening approached, Holmes drew me aside to outline his plan for the night ahead. "We must position ourselves strategically, Watson," he explained. "I anticipate that our ghost will make her most dramatic appearance yet tonight, particularly after Richard's announcement at dinner. I want you stationed in the corridor outside Richard's chamber from midnight onwards. I shall be concealed in the hidden passage adjacent to his room." "You believe Richard will be the next target?" I asked. "Without question. The pattern has been established. Each victim saw the phantom bride shortly before their death. Geoffrey, Agatha, Henry, and now Richard has reported his first sighting. Charlotte too, though I believe she was merely a diversion, a means of heightening the atmosphere of supernatural dread." Holmes proceeded to set various preparations in motion, checking and adjusting the angles of certain mirrors in key locations throughout the house, and examining the hinges of several doors to ensure silent operation. He also retrieved his revolver from his luggage, checking it carefully before slipping it into his pocket. "Armed, Holmes?" I queried, surprised at this precaution. "Our adversary has already claimed 3 lives, Watson. While I believe the deaths appeared to be from natural causes, heart failure induced by extreme fright, I cannot discount the possibility of more direct methods should desperation arise." As darkness fell, the household gathered for dinner, joined by Sir William and Lady Blackwood, who had been invited to return following the previous evening's interrupted festivities. I noted that Holmes had arranged the seating so that Richard was placed directly opposite Mrs. Fairweather, with the chandelier light falling fully upon her face. During the meal, Richard formally announced his engagement to Miss Hartley, describing her in glowing terms as the daughter of a distinguished London family. The news was greeted with general congratulations and toasts to the happy couple. Throughout these proceedings, Mrs. Fairweather maintained her composure, offering her own good wishes with appropriate warmth, while betraying no sign of distress. Later, as the guests departed and the household prepared for the night, Holmes made a show of retiring early, complaining of fatigue. I lingered in the drawing-room with Edward and Charlotte until shortly before midnight, when I too excused myself, only to position myself as directed in the darkened corridor outside Richard's chamber. The house grew quiet as the hour advanced, the only sounds the occasional creak of ancient timbers and the distant moaning of the wind, which had begun to rise again as a new storm approached. From my position in shadow, I had a clear view of both Richard's door and the length of the corridor leading to the main staircase. My revolver lay ready in my hand, partially concealed by the folds of my dressing gown. As the grandfather clock in the hall below struck the first notes of midnight, I perceived a subtle change in the quality of the darkness surrounding me, a sense that I was no longer alone in my vigil. The storm outside had drawn closer, and the first rumble of thunder provided an ominous accompaniment to the tense silence within Darkwater's walls. Chapter 8. The Phantom Revealed. I had maintained my position in the darkened corridor for perhaps 15 minutes when a flash of lightning illuminated the hallway, followed almost immediately by a tremendous crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of Darkwater. In that brief moment of electric brilliance, I caught a glimpse of a white figure at the far end of the passage, a woman in flowing robes, her face indistinct in the sudden glare and darkness. My heart leapt into my throat despite my rational preparation for this moment. There was something unnervingly ethereal about the apparition, even knowing it must be of human agency. As the thunder subsided, I perceived the figure gliding silently toward Richard's chamber, the white garment seeming to float above the floor in the gloom. I remained motionless, following Holmes's strict instructions to allow the phantom to enter Richard's room before making my move. The spectral bride passed within a few feet of my hiding place, close enough that I detected the faint rustle of fabric and a subtle scent of lavender. The figure paused before Richard's door, one pale hand extending toward the handle, and I tensed in readiness. At that precise moment, Holmes's voice rang out from within the chamber. "I believe we have waited long enough for our ghostly visitor, Watson." The phantom froze, then turned to flee, but I had already stepped into the corridor, blocking the retreat. Simultaneously, Holmes flung open Richard's door, a bright lamp in his hand illuminating the scene. In that sudden, harsh light, our phantom bride stood revealed, no longer ethereal, but startlingly corporeal. Mrs. Fairweather stared back at us, her face a mask of conflict, pride, defiance, and a flicker of fear. She was dressed in an antiquated wedding gown of yellowed satin, her grey hair concealed beneath a bridal veil. In the lamplight, her resemblance to the portrait of Edward's great-grandmother was striking. "A most convincing performance, Mrs. Fairweather," Holmes remarked, his voice calm but firm. "Though I believe the audience has grown weary of the production." From within the room, Richard appeared, his expression a mixture of shock and sorrow. "Margaret," he whispered. "Why?" Before she could respond, we heard hurried footsteps, and Edward and Charlotte arrived, followed by several servants awakened by the commotion. Charlotte gasped at the sight of Mrs. Fairweather in her bridal attire. "I think," said Holmes, "that we should all adjourn to the library. There is much to be explained, and I believe Mrs. Fairweather deserves the opportunity to be heard." Once assembled in the library, with lamps lit and a fire hastily kindled against the chill of the night, Holmes directed Mrs. Fairweather to a chair. She sat with remarkable dignity, the incongruous wedding dress pooling around her feet. "Before we begin," Holmes said, "I should note that I have taken the liberty of summoning the local constable. He should arrive within the hour." He turned to the governess. "Mrs. Fairweather? Or perhaps I should say, Miss Margaret Darkwater." A ripple of shock passed through the family members present. Mrs. Fairweather lifted her chin proudly. "You are well informed, Mr. Holmes," she acknowledged, "though that name has not been mine for many years." "You are a Darkwater by blood, though not by legal recognition," Holmes continued. "The natural daughter of the previous master of Darkwater, Edward and Charlotte's grandfather, born to a housemaid and conveniently established in the household under the guise of a distant relation fallen on hard times." "How could you possibly know this?" Edward demanded, his face pale with shock. "My brother Mycroft has access to certain records," Holmes explained. The confirmation arrived by telegram this afternoon, but I had already surmised as much from various clues. Mrs. Fairweather's striking resemblance to the family, her unusual position of privilege within the household, and the special education she received, unusual for one of her ostensible background. Mrs. Fairweather's composure remained unshaken. "Your deductions are accurate, Mr. Holmes. I am indeed the daughter of Francis Darkwater, though he never publicly acknowledged me. He did, however, provide for my education and ensure I always had a place at Darkwater." "And in return, you served the family loyally for decades," Holmes observed, "until something changed." He turned to Richard. "Or someone." Richard's face reflected dawning comprehension. "You believed I had promised to marry you once I inherited the estate," he said quietly to Mrs. Fairweather. "After my parents died and you raised me." "You did promise," she replied, her voice suddenly fierce, perhaps not in so many words, but in 1,000 small ways over the years. "Who nursed you through childhood illness? Who educated you, shaped your mind, your tastes? Who stood by you when others doubted your capabilities? And then, at the first opportunity, you seek a fashionable London bride, discarding me as carelessly as your father did." "But the deaths," Charlotte interjected, her voice trembling. "Geoffrey, Aunt Agatha, Uncle Henry, you frightened them to death." Mrs. Fairweather's face softened slightly as she looked at Charlotte. "I never intended death, child, merely to eliminate obstacles. The heart failures were an unfortunate consequence of their weak constitutions. The apparition was meant to drive them away from Darkwater, to hasten Richard's inheritance. The deaths were regrettable, but ultimately served the same purpose." Holmes had been examining a small mechanism he had extracted from his pocket, what appeared to be a miniature pulley with a fine white thread attached. "A most ingenious system," he remarked. "You utilized the hidden passages and your intimate knowledge of the house to create your manifestations. The pulley mechanism to manipulate fabric at a distance strategically placed mirrors to create the illusion of a figure where none existed, and careful timing with the thunder to mask any sounds of your movement. The original bride of Darkwater provided an excellent model," Mrs. Fairweather acknowledged. "The family had already half convinced themselves of her existence. I merely gave substance to their superstition." "And your resemblance to the portrait made the deception all the more convincing when glimpsed briefly," Holmes added, "particularly when the observer was already primed to see a phantom." As Mrs. Fairweather began to explain in greater detail the mechanics of her deception, the local constable arrived, accompanied by Dr. Winters. Holmes presented the evidence methodically: the threads, the fabric samples, diagrams of the pulley system, and the architectural plans showing the hidden passages. Mrs. Fairweather made no attempt to deny her actions, maintaining her dignity even as the constable placed her under arrest. Before she was led away, she turned to Richard one final time. "I may not have Darkwater blood legally recognized in my veins, but I am as much a Darkwater as any of you. Remember that, Richard, when you bring your London bride to this house. I shall be watching, even from behind prison walls." The storm had passed by the time the constable departed with Mrs. Fairweather, leaving a strange calm over Darkwater. Dawn was breaking as Holmes and I joined Edward on the terrace, watching the pale sun rise over the lake that had given the estate its name. "I can scarcely believe it," Edward said after a long silence. "To think that Mrs. Fairweather, who was like family to us all—" "She was family," Holmes observed quietly. "That was the tragedy of it. Denied her birthright, she sought to claim it through the only means available to her, by binding Richard to her through obligation and affection, and then eliminating those who stood between him and his inheritance. And the engagement announcement drove her to make her final move," I added, understanding at last the purpose of Holmes's stratagem. "Precisely, Watson. The prospect of losing Richard to a London bride when her plans were so close to fruition was the catalyst needed to force her hand. Holmes lit his pipe, the smoke drifting lazily in the morning air. A sad business, but not without its precedents. The human heart, when denied its deepest desires, is capable of extraordinary self-deception and terrible acts. As we prepared to depart Darkwater later that morning, I took a final look at the imposing grey stone edifice, its windows reflecting the tentative sunlight. The phantom bride had been revealed as all too human, yet something of her lingering presence seemed to cling to the ancient walls, a reminder of thwarted ambition and the destructive power of secrets long buried. In the carriage returning to the station, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent, his keen features set in lines of thoughtful contemplation. I knew from experience that he found little satisfaction in cases where the solution, however brilliant, brought more sorrow than justice. The mystery of the phantom bride of Darkwater estate had been solved, but the tragedy it revealed would haunt its inhabitants long after our departure from those troubled halls. I hope you enjoyed our journey through the phantom bride of Darkwater estate. If you did, please consider becoming a member of our Cafe Stories community. Your support helps keep these tales of mystery and adventure coming. Until next time, stay curious, keep your powers of observation sharp, and remember, when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains must be the truth. This is Alfie, signing off from Cafe Stories.